In the previous part, we looked at how we can get our weapon to display different sprites depending on which weapon we have equipped. We did this by creating our first weapon component, this WeaponSprite component. Our goal for today is to take our WeaponSprite data over here and this weapon data and move it into a WeaponData scriptable object. We're doing this because the weapon needs to generate its different components based on its weapon data. So when we equip a new weapon, nothing happens to our weapon game object. Instead, it just changes the weapon components attached to it to whatever it needs to build up its functionality, which is again defined by this data component. So welcome to Barden. My name is Heinrich, and let's get into it. Okay, so let's start off by just creating the scriptable object that we're going to use. So let's come to our File Explorer, and let's come to our scripts folder. And then in here, we already have this scriptable objects folder. In here, we have this weapons folder that has some classes from our previous attempt at a weapon system. So we can just go ahead and delete those. We no longer need them. Now in this scriptable objects folder, let's go ahead and create a new script. So right click, say add. And again, because I'm using Writer, I can say Unity script, which is going to allow me to create a scriptable object right from here. And I'm just going to call it WeaponDataSO. So you can see that this is just a basic scriptable object. We have our WeaponDataSO inheriting from scriptable object. And then it also pre-generated this create asset menu attribute for us, which has a file name and a menu name. Let's go ahead and give it a file name of just new weapon data. And then for the menu name, I'm going to say data, weapon data, basic weapon data. This data object is going to hold everything that we need to know about a weapon. Things like its name, its description, the image that it should show if it was in your inventory or in a store or something, how many attacks it has, and then most importantly, what components build up its logic. So let's start off with the basic stuff first. We're already making use of data such as the number of attacks. So let's start by moving that over. Let's open up our File Explorer and let's come to our weapon script. And then over here at the very top, we have this number of attacks variable. Let's just go ahead and cut this away from here. And then let's come back to our scriptable object, so WeaponDataSO, and just paste it in here. And now real quick, I notice up here that our namespace is wrong. So I actually just want this to be in the Barden.weapons namespace. So we have this number of attacks variable over here now, but our weapon somehow needs to reference it. So let's go ahead and turn this into an auto property. So we'll rename it to number of attacks with a capital N, and then change it from private to public. And then don't forget to give it its public getter and private setter. And now because this is an auto property, serialize field isn't enough to show this property in the inspector. We have to add field in front of it like that. So that means we can come back to our weapon script. Let's create a variable for our weapon data. So it's going to be a public WeaponDataSO, just called data. Give it a public getter and a private setter. And we're doing that because our weapon component is going to reference the data through the weapon. And then of course, to make it visible in the inspector, we can go ahead and add field, serialize field attribute at the front like that. Now over here, where we make use of the number of attacks, we can just say data dot number of attacks. Okay, so let's quickly come back to our WeaponDataSO and let's talk about our weapon component datas. So we want to make a list of components that this weapon has, but unfortunately we can't just make a list of mono behaviors because we just can't edit it that way in the inspector. The mono behaviors needs to be attached to a game object to function that way. So instead what we're going to do is we need to separate the component logic from its data, and then we can store that data and use the data to know what components we want to add to the weapon. So which components build up the logic. So step one is to separate out this data. Now we have two different types of data. We have component data and we have attack data. Component data holds all the data that a certain component needs. So this could be things that need to be defined once, like a layer mask that the hitbox might need to use. And then it also consists of the attack data, which is this other data that I mentioned, which is data that the component data has multiple copies of. It has an array of this data type, where each element in the array specifies specific data for an attack. So for example, with our weapon sprites, we have an array of sprites for one of the attacks. And then we have another array which holds all of these different arrays of sprites that we cycle through with our attack counter. I hope I'm not overcomplicating this. So let's just jump into it and start working through it, and hopefully it'll make sense. Let's start off by creating another folder over here in our weapons components folder. I'm just going to call it ComponentData. In here, let's go ahead and create just a normal C# class that we again can just call ComponentData. Okay, so this is the base class that any component data is going to inherit from. And we need to do this because if we want to make a list of all of this different component data, they need to share a class that we can use as our lists type. And along with that, we're also going to do a bunch of stuff in here that all the component data needs to do anyway, so it just makes sense. So we have this component data class. We're not going to be doing anything in here yet. This is just so that we can make the list. Let's go ahead and create another C# class that is going to be our WeaponSpriteData. So my naming convention is going to be the weapon component followed just by data. Now we need to make sure that this class inherits from our component data. And now in here we can define the data for each of our attacks. Now our WeaponSpriteData doesn't have any global settings for the component. It only has those sprites for each of the attacks. So what we need to do is simply from our WeaponSprites class, move this over there. But I'm actually going to rename some things. So I'm just going to get rid of this variable and then come down to the class that we created and also just get rid of that. So we'll have some errors, but we'll come back and deal with that in just a second. Next, in our component data folder, let's go ahead and add another folder. This is going to be called AttackData. So in here, we're going to put all the classes that make up data for a specific attack for a component. So you can see kind of logically how I'm structuring this. Our component data makes use of the attack data, and our components make use of the component data. In the attack data, let's start off by creating a new C# class, and this is just going to be called AttackSprites. I think this makes more sense as a class name than weapon sprites like we had before. So AttackSprites is data that represents all the sprites for a single attack. So in here, let's create an auto property. So we'll say field, serialize field, public sprite array. We'll just call it sprites, like that. And then don't forget to give it the public getter and the private setter. Okay, so with the attack sprites created, we can come back to our WeaponSpriteData class. And in here, again, the same thing. We want a field, serialize field, public, and this time the data type is our attack sprites. And we want an array of that because we're going to have one of these for each of our attacks. And this time, let's just call it attack data. And again, don't forget the public getter and the private setter. Okay, so with this data created, we can go ahead and come and fix our errors in the WeaponSprite class from before. In here, the first thing we need to do is we need a variable to hold that data. So let's go ahead and declare a private WeaponSpriteData. And we'll just call it data with a lowercase d. And now we're not exposing this to the inspector or anything because the component is going to go get this data from the data scriptable object on the weapon. And so with this data created, we can come back down over here. So in our handle-based sprite change function, we're trying to get the current attack sprites. So this is the array of sprites for the current attack. We can get this by saying data dot attack data, which is the array of all of our different possible attack datas, and we just pass in our current attack counter. So now our weapon sprite component will make use of this data, but we still need to set this data somewhere. So let's talk about that for a second. If we come back to Unity, we'll get a bunch of errors because the game was running. We can stop that, clear that out. Okay, so now our weapons has this data field that doesn't have anything in it. So let's go ahead and create our data real quick. So just in our assets folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called data. And this actually reminds me that in our scripts folder, we have this data folder, which also holds some scriptable object assets from, again, the stuff we were trying to do before. Let's go ahead and delete that if you have it. We don't need it anymore. And then back in our new data folder, let's right click, say create data, weapon data, and then basic weapon data. Let's call the first one just sword_1. And let's Control D on that to duplicate it, F2 to rename, and sword_2. Okay, so both these data components, we can go ahead and set the number of attacks equal to 3, because our sword has 3 swings. But now you can see we can't see this list that we created. And that is because we need to serialize our classes. Now, this isn't something that I completely understand, I just kind of know how to do it. But you might want to do your own research for a better explanation on Unity serialization. But essentially, all we need to do is we come to our ComponentData class. At the top over here, we have to add the serializable attribute, which sits in the system namespace. And then we also need to come to our AttackSprites and go ahead and serialize this. So add serializable up there. So now if we come back to Unity, hopefully that worked. It did not. Let's take a look at our weapon data scriptable object, and that is because we haven't actually defined it yet. So, whoops, my bad, I skipped a step. Okay, so in here we need to create a variable that is our list of component datas. So it's just going to be a public list, and the type that we're going to use is our ComponentData base class that we created, and we'll just call it ComponentDatas. Now don't forget to give this a public getter and a private setter. And to make sure that we can expose it in the inspector, come to the front again and add the field, serialize field attribute. Let me just go ahead and close the file explorer on the side there. Okay, so now we have this list of component datas. Now we should be able to see it in Unity. Sorry about that. So if we come back to Unity, there we go. You'll see we have this component datas drop down. And this currently is just an empty list. Now, if we go ahead and hit the plus icon over here, you'll see it adds an element, but we can't do anything with it. It's not showing our sprite data like we want. And that is because when we hit the plus icon over here, it doesn't add one of the child classes, it adds the base class, the type of this list, which is just the base component data class, which doesn't hold anything. So it's just an element. There's nothing we can do with it. So what we need to do is we need to create our own way of adding specific types of classes to this list. That's going to be a topic for another episode. For now, we're just going to create a test function that specifically adds our WeaponSpriteData to this list with a context menu button to call that function. So let's come back to our scripts. And in our WeaponDataSO, let's just create a private void function that's called AddSpriteData. And all this function does is we say ComponentData, and I'm actually going to rename this to ComponentData without the S, like that, dot add new WeaponSpriteData. So this function will add a new sprite data component to our list. Now to be able to call it from the editor, we just need to add a context menu attribute to the top of it. And the name is just going to be AddSpriteData. So this isn't how we're going to do it in the future. This is just demonstration for now. Let's make sure this is working the way we want it to before we expand on the functionality of our WeaponDataSO. So let's come back to Unity and take a look at our sword1 data again. So now if we take a look at the burger drop-down menu over here, you'll see that there's an Add Sprite Data button. If we click that, it adds an element to our component data, but we still can't see anything. So what's up with that? Now again, I'm not completely an expert in this, but our serialize field attribute over here is only making it so it serializes the specific type of this list. So it still doesn't know that that is a WeaponSpriteData component. What we need to do is we need to change this from field serialize field to field serialize reference. And so what that'll do is it should serialize the specific component that each element in that array is, instead of just the base class. So now if we come back to Unity, it might not work yet. I think we might have to remove this element and add add it again. Yep, there we go. Some serialization magic in the background is happening. But so there we go. We now have our first element in this weapon data. And here we can see our attack data dropdown, which is an empty list currently. If we add an element here, we can add an array of sprites. Perfect, that's exactly what we wanted. And if you still don't see this, just go ahead and make sure that you've added serializable to the correct classes. So if we take a look at our component data, we added serializable over here. Our WeaponSpriteData, we did not need to add it over here, but our AttackSprites class, we did have to add it over here. So just to be clear, I kind of just throw it everywhere to figure out where it needs to be. If somebody can explain to me exactly how to know where to add these, that would be great. But when in doubt, just throw them in until it works. Okay, so with that done, we can go ahead and quickly add our sprites back in. So let's come back to Unity. And now, just like before in the last episode, we need to drag in our sprites. So I'm going to lock the inspector for sword 1, make sure we have our WeaponSprite component data added, and then add three elements to our attack data list over here. Scroll down to our sword sprites, expand the sword 1, and then sprites 0 through 4 is the first one, 5 through 9 is the second one, and 10 through 14 is the third one. Then come back to the data folder, click on sword 2, unlock the inspector, lock it again, go ahead and add a sprite data component, add 3 elements for our 3 attacks, come back to our sprites, expand sword 2, sprites 0 through 4, is our attack 1, 5 through 9 is attack 2, and 10 through 14 is attack 3. Okay, so now our 2 data assets have the sprites that we're looking for, but our WeaponSprite component still doesn't have access to this. So one last thing that we need to do before we can test is, let's come back to our script, come to our WeaponDataSO. In here, we need to create a function that our weapon components can use to ask this list for its specific data. So after this, let's go ahead and declare a public function, and the return type for this function is going to be t, which is our generic type. We're going to call this function just getData and specify t as our generic type. And then in here, all we need to do is we say return ComponentData dot of type, where of type is a function in the link namespace. And what it's going to do is it takes a look at the list and just gets all the objects in that list that has this specific type that we're about to specify, which is just our generic type t. So it's going to get a list of all those components, and then we just say dot first or default to just get one of them. Then we can come to our WeaponSprite component over here, and in the awake function, after we've set the reference to our 2 sprite renderers, let's go ahead and say data equals weapon.data.getData, and the data type that we want is our WeaponSpriteData. So here we're passing in WeaponSpriteData as our generic type t. So it's going to look through that list for all the components that has this specific type. And in the future, we're going to make sure that only one of these exist in that list anyway. So don't worry about that. But for now, we should be able to test this and everything should work. Fingers crossed. Let's go back to Unity. Let's make sure our weapons have their data references, which they don't. So for the primary weapon, I want sword 1. And for our secondary weapon, I want sword 2. Now, if we go ahead and run the game, there we go. Everything still works. If we change any of our data, so let's say for sword 2, we change the attack number to just 2. If we attack now, you'll see only the first 2 attacks play. Okay, and so that's just a quick introduction to our weapon data. There's still a lot of stuff that we need to do here, but that's essentially what this structure is going to be. We have our component data, which sits in our scriptable object, which will eventually be used to help generate our weapons. So that'll be how we know which components to add to our weapon. And our component data is going to consist of global settings for that component and attack-specific data that might change for every single attack. I hope this one wasn't too all over the place. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to ask on Discord. I'm always happy to explain my madness that is this video. And so that's going to do it for this episode. I'm not 100% sure what the next episode is going to be on yet. We might create our second component, which is probably going to be our movement component. So the component responsible for moving our character in different ways during the attack. That might be it, no promises. Just so that we can look at what some other components are going to look like before we expand upon the data that we just created and figure out some of the more generic stuff that we're going to do here just to make our lives easier. So look out for that. It should be up next week. And remember, if you would like early access to the completed prototype for this project, it is available to all of my Patreon tiers. And so with that said, I would just like to say thank you to all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon. And a huge special thank you to Cody Lee, SM, Madrasins, Jake Skarupa, Patrick, Itami, Mike Rodriguez, Nathan Ackley, and Christopher Rios for your support. You guys are absolute mad lads, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.